Hey everyone, good evening. I wasn't going to do another video today, but if half of the news that's coming out of Ukraine and Russia right now is true, we could be seeing not only something impactful for the war in Ukraine, but also potentially for the history of the world, the global order. It could be an incredibly important series of events. The caveat here will be lengthy, however, in that, we're talking about potential, the Wagner Group, right? We're talking about Russia. We're talking about a state built on lies. We're talking about a army of mercenaries run by a man who, really came up running a troll farm, right? Interfering with the U.S. election, other elections, right? Evgeny Prigozhin was intimately involved in the Internet Research Agency. He's literally a propagandist, right? I'm not sure, and I'm not smart enough to know what the advantage to Russia would be to promote this story if it was false. To say that the Wagner Group was somehow invading Russian territory and that a Wagner base had been hit with a missile strike and hundreds or thousands of Wagnerites have been killed. I don't know why that would be beneficial to Putin or Shoigu or Prigozhin or anybody, right? I think there's an incredible amount of fog of war here, and we need to very carefully understand that and understand that what we have to go on is information from people who all have an agenda, right? And we also need to note that as of right now, there's not a lot of footage. There's not a lot of independent confirmation of any of these things that are purported to have happened as having happened. At the same time, this is an information environment. This is a part of the world where a despot in Putin has destroyed much of civil society and destroyed the free press right over decades. And then it's also a war zone where information is quite tightly controlled and understandably on both sides, I guess, is quite tightly constrained, right? So that out of the way, what we're really here, I think, to discuss and think about is, and I'll frame it in the context of videos that I've made in the past, although I don't want to try to make myself sound like some kind of a prophet, but those because I'm certainly not. But those of you who've watched the channel for a while will know I've been harping on an issue that I think is quite related to the events we're seeing in Ukraine and Western Russia this evening, and that is in despotic regimes, in authoritarian regimes, often forced conscription is utilized to bolster the armed forces. And while initially this is provides for a shot in the arm, right? It's a lot of people to devote to something, and it looks very intimidating on paper. When you compare the manpower advantages that, say, Russia would have over a Ukraine, there are consequences, right? There's no free lunch, right? And there are reasons why every developed country basically has moved away from drafts and has moved away from forced conscription. And one of it's sort of I'll frame it as a feedback loop, a non-virtuous cycle. And that cycle is when you conscript people, you inevitably gather many people into a combat situation who did not want to be there, right? Who did not choose to be there. And what you then have is not only have you forced a bunch of people who don't want to be there into a military, hurting morale among other things. The leadership, right, of that military will clearly know, right? They will have records. They will have an awareness of who was here beforehand, who wants to be here, who's a true believer, and who's a hippie peacenik who got recruited from college to be here, right? And this disparity means you will have haves and have-nots. You'll have people who get the resources first. You'll have the people who get the training first, and you'll have people who don't get those things. And this obviously creates further animosity. It creates further discontent within the ranks of the people who are forced to be there, and so on and so forth, right? You can see how this creates a situation where you have a bunch of people who aren't going to be that good at fighting, who will surrender more quickly, whose morale will be in the toilet for a lot of that time. And you also start to have this bifurcation between soldiers who can operate at a high level and soldiers who won't because they don't want to. right? And they're also not equipped to do that. And my original prediction, which I think it has, if what we're seeing out of Ukraine, again, is even half true, my prediction will hold some merit. But I'll add this caveat. But my prediction was essentially, if you start to force this kind of conscription, a bunch of people will flee the country first and foremost if they can, which we have seen in Russia, and you will also see potentially, kind of organically in the armed forces, groups will emerge. Critical masses will be reached, right, in the armed forces, because you have enough people together who hate this situation, who are very unhappy with the situation, and they won't be siloed, right? It won't be one person out of 10 in a unit. It will be, everybody will know people who are pissed off at the situation, and they will start to organize, and they will start to organize around whether it's surrendering or sabotaging things or whatever it might be, right? Staging a mutiny or some kind of coup. And this has happened before. The example that I have given a lot is the Estado Novo and the Portuguese colonial wars that really ended that authoritarian regime, and I think have a lot of parallels to what's going on in Russia right now. But the caveat I would give, the fascinating caveat with the Wagner Group is, and what I didn't predict, is that the conscription did create these non-virtuous cycles. It did create these feedback loops, right? We've heard all these reports of these incredibly undertrained, undersupplied, ineffective attacks by the Russian military, ending just disastrously over and over and over in Bakhmut and elsewhere. Just is, almost unbelievable numbers coming out of Ukraine about the number of Russian soldiers who've been killed, and their lack of training, and it's incredibly immoral, obviously for many reasons, but this one included, right? And the Wagner Group, partly because of that, and partly because a lot of the other special operators and special forces groups that the Russians wanted to use in this war did so poorly at the initial invasion, right? A lot of the paratroop units that were so lauded ended up being pretty feckless and dysfunctional. The Wagner Group really stepped in many ways, and again, I'll say this, as a relatively effective group of operators who were experienced in combat and could be relied on to take territory, right? To do the hard work of offensive operations and take territory like Bakhmut, which they appear to have done at least somewhat successfully. What has happened now, and what modifies my original prediction, was that group of people was relied on by the Russian state, really because of the ineffectiveness of the rest of the armed forces, right? Because of the conscription, the armed forces needed a group of operators who knew what they were doing, thus Wagner. And then what's precipitated all of what's happening, or looks like what's happening now, is the Ministry of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, basically the armed forces that in the traditional sense have tried to, over time, deprioritize the Wagner Group and kind of reconsolidate them back into the military at large. And what happened in the last few days, as I understand it, potentially even as recently as yesterday, is the Ministry of Defense essentially promulgated a contract to Wagner mercenaries saying, you guys need to come back into the fold. You're now sign this document because you're now working for us. You're not working for an independent Wagner Group. That appears to not have gone very well. I'm not sure. It's very difficult to tell if that happened first and then this potential missile strike happened on a Wagner camp. It really, that stuff we can't speculate on yet. It's just too foggy, I think. But I think it's safe to say that my prediction was right in that a group of people did coalesce that had real grievances and real frustrations with the military, with the state, with the armed forces, with the general policy that was being pursued to fight this war. Where I was wrong was that group didn't need to emerge organically. The Russian military, the Russian state really built it, intentionally, right? It wasn't something that needed to emerge out of, backroom meetings and things like that, between people who had kind of, gotten to the end of their rope, who were originally, within the military. This was something that was built. This organization that is Wagner, was built because because the conscription-based policy that was pursued by the Russian state didn't work very well, and they knew that, right? They knew that it wasn't working. They knew their troops were doing very poorly. They knew they had these Wagner guys who could do this, right? So they actually pre-baked this thing, this distinction, right? And now that they're trying to eliminate that distinction, the Wagner group has mutinied, it would appear. If Evgeny Prigozhin is to be believed, the Wagner group has moved into Russian territory. I don't know if you could count that as an invasion. I mean, these are Russian soldiers. This would be more of a civil war kind of a situation. But according to Prigozhin, they're being welcomed with open arms. And really, if you look at his missives, what you'll see is a man who at least purports to be extremely concerned about these very people that we're talking about, right? These forced conscripts who are untrained, who are boys, he calls them, and notes that they have been put in an impossible situation. So he's now, it looks like, leading some kind of, at times he's called it a march, at times he's intimated that it's going to be a more violent experience than that. We've heard reports that the FSB has put out an arrest warrant for him. We've also heard that there is now active effort in Russian media to dredge up some of his unsavory past and maybe more, you could say, accurately portray who he is. He's not a choir boy for sure, but potentially a sign that the state is kind of breaking from its support of him. But yeah, overall, an incredibly nuanced and complex situation. And again, one we need to be extremely, you need to be able to hold these facts in your head, but also realize that none of this could be right? This could all be extremely misleading, and we will have to learn that as it goes on. But from the perspective of, was my mutiny prediction correct? I would say yes, in a sense, but yeah, obviously no, right? I didn't predict that this would happen to Wagner. You would say that, if you were looking at this as a model of other authoritarian regimes, Wagner would be the people who would have maintained their allegiance to the state, right? There'd be some other, as I imagined it, some other group, a grassroots group of people who'd been conscripted and who were pissed about that, right? And what's so fascinating about this is this twist, right, that history has given us, which is to effectively prosecute this war, the Russians had to utilize Wagner. They're now trying to rein Wagner in, and that appears to not be working at all, right? They've actually created a splinter group that they're now potentially facing in live combat. So I will certainly be staying glued to this story for the next, for the foreseeable near future here. I recommend you do the same. It's something that I think the world will increasingly be watching over the next few hours to days. And as always, I really appreciate you watching. I appreciate your thoughtful comments. As always, I continue to learn a lot from you guys in the comments. So thanks again, and see you soon.